strike, comrades. Well, it's almost exactly 40 years since the beginning of the Great Miners' Strike of 1984 to 1985. And I think there's no doubt, with the benefit of hindsight, this is one of the most important industrial disputes, certainly of the 20th century, and probably, in terms of Britain anyway, ever. And the effects of that strike are still very much with us today. And the defeat of the miners was a crucial turning point in the imposition of the ruling class's neoliberal agenda on British society, which we're still very much suffering from to this day. And although the miners' strike was very much presented at the time and afterwards as the sort of last roar of a dying dinosaur, I'm going to argue that this was a strike that really could and should have won. And also, if I have time, which I might not, I'll talk about some of the lessons for us today, and if I don't, hopefully you guys will. Okay, so, because there's a lot to talk about, to do justice to this epic struggle, really. Because in the early 70s, we saw some of the greatest victories for workers in the history of Britain, which Eddie can tell us quite a bit about. In terms of the mining industry, the Tories were humiliated both by national miners' strikes in both 1972 and 1974. In fact, in February 1974, during the second miners' strike, Ted Heath, the Tory Prime Minister at the time, called an election asking the electorate who runs the country, and the electorate basically said, "Not you, mate." So that was how things were in the 70s. But in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected. And for Thatcher's incoming government, the militant trade unionism, in particular the miners, was really the central obstacle into the British ruling class, restoring its crisis-ridden economy and particularly the profits of big business. And even before the election, the Tories had got a plan for taking on and smashing the unions one at a time. This was known as the Ridley Plan, after a certain Nicholas Ridley. And basically the Ridley Plan aimed to learn from the mistakes of Ted Heath, who had taken the unions all at once on pay and anti-union laws. And the Thatcher regime basically planned to take on the unions one at a time, starting with the weakest. For instance, the steel workers and health workers. And then they would take them on one at a time, and then isolate and defeat the National Union of Mine Workers, the NUM for short. And at the same time, they brought in a series of laws, which are still on the statute book to this day, that outlawed things like solidarity strikes, which were pretty normal at the time, compulsory postal ballots, another new innovation, although ironically the NUM always had ballots for strike action, albeit not postal ones, and also there were restrictions on picketing as well. But none of this would have worked had the unions all stood together right from the beginning. It was very obvious what Thatcher's agenda was, but instead they did not. The steel workers were taken on and defeated after a 10-week strike. The health workers had on and off strike action in 1982. They were also defeated. And another factor that made this possible was the fact that during the strikes of the 70s, secondary action, mass picketing was the norm, and that's what really was crucial to the defeats inflicted on the Tories in the 70s. But the confidence of rank and file workers, which was crucial for all that, had been really damaged by the 74 to 79 Labour government, and that Labour government had imposed something linely called a social contract, which was basically a deal between the Labour government and the union leaders to slash wages and public services. And basically both the right and the left-wing union leaders went along with it. So fast forward to 1983, Margaret Thatcher is re-elected with a huge majority, and one of her first actions is to appoint a guy called Ian McGregor as head of the National Coal Board, which was the mines were all nationalised. The National Coal Board was the body that ran the pits, and Ian McGregor was basically a hitman who was employed to take on and smash the NUM. And he'd already presided over big job losses in British Leyland, which was Britain's major car company at the time, and he was also in charge of the offensive against British Steel I've already mentioned. And the Tories, it was basically a declaration of war against the mining industry as a whole. They're planning to close 70 pits, and plans were laid in secret for taking on and defeating a national coal strike. In the months leading up to the start of the strike, the NGA, the print union, was de-recognised at Stockport Messenger, a seemingly small dispute, but this was really a precursor of what was to come. And then in February of 1984, the Tories actually banned trade unions at GCHQ. And to both of these major attacks, the trade unions, the TUC, basically did pretty well, almost nothing. They did call an unofficial sort of few-hour strike over GCHQ, but there was no real serious opposition. And the trade union leaders by this time were gripped by pessimism, the doctrine of new realism it was called at the time, that there was nothing we could do, Thatcher was invincible. But the National Union Mine Workers had enormous power. There was still 180,000 miners. That was in Britain. That was had been 1 million after World War II, but it was still, because of productivity deals, technology, etc. The 180,000 miners were very powerful. There were 180 pits, and these pits produced coal that provided 80% of electricity used in Britain in both people's homes and industry. So they had enormous industrial muscle. And basically the Tories were out for revenge on the NUM, as well as other things from the defeats that had inflicted on them in the 70s. And the Coal Board announced mass pit closures in February 1981, but that was met by an official walkout across the country, which forced the NCB, the Tories, to retreat. In the same year, Arthur Scargill was elected as president of the National Union Mine Workers, and this was a real, this was a guy who played a crucial role in a wave of unofficial strikes across the coalfield in 1969. He played a key role at area level in the 72 and 74 strikes, and the election of Arthur Scargill, the individual synonymous with militant trade unionism, was a clear sign that the miners were up for a fight. They weren't going to go down without a fight. And so on the 1st of March 1984, the Coal Board announced the closure of Cortonwood, which was a pit in South Yorkshire. And this was a clear provocation. There was still 5 years' worth of coal under the ground at Cortonwood, but they picked on Cortonwood because it had a reputation of not being a militant pit. And the Tories were also worried about declining coal stocks due to a NUM overtime ban which was in place, so they were kind of anxious to get on with it. Cortonwood voted to strike, and then the NCB announced plans for a further 20 pit closures in an attempt to kind of demoralise the miners. But both the Yorkshire and Scottish area NUMs called their members out on strike. There were flying pickets went into the rest of the coalfields, South Wales, Notts and Kent, and closed. So the whole of the every pit in the country was quickly out on strike, and Thatcher was kind of furious. This wasn't part of the plan. So this was the beginning. Well, it wasn't the start of it. It started with the Stockport Messenger dispute. Really the use of untrammeled police violence against pickets, and she ordered the chief constables to stop Yorkshire pickets talking to the Notts miners because they were successfully persuading them not to go into work. 8,000 police were sent into Notts to stop the Yorkshire pickets, and 1,000 miners were arrested in this operation. And the problem with the Nottinghamshire coalfield, well, it was the most productive. That shouldn't have been a problem, but in this context it was, because it meant that the seams where the coal is packed together underground were much bigger than the other coal fields, so it's much easier to get the coal out. And also there'd been the previous Labour government had imposed the agreement with the officials an area by area productivity deal, which really undermined the miners, and it meant the Notts miners felt that they had jobs for life, they were earning more money because of productivity, so they didn't have so much of interest in fighting. But in fact this wasn't true, because they were equally threatened by job losses because of introduction of new technology. This was kept quiet from them by the Notts area NUM officials at the time. And so the NUM officials were not at all, in Notts, weren't at all keen to strike at all, and they made a deal with the Yorkshire area officials that they would call off the pickets while the Notts miners held a ballot. So this was a disaster really, because they voted 4-1 not to strike, not to join the national strike. And this was, you know, a minority. 20% did strike for the whole year in Notts despite this vote. But this was obviously a major issue right from the beginning of the strike. And it also reflected the problem with the fact the NUM's structure was a federal structure, so there's quite a lot of autonomy, because it had formerly been called the Miners' Federation before World War II, and some of that still prevailed, which meant that areas had a tradition of doing their own thing, which was a huge problem. And also this ballot held by Nottinghamshire was another a good kind of argument for the Tories and the NCB and the Labour leader Neil Kinnock to cynically argue for that all the miners should have had a ballot. And this was totally challenged at the time by people on the left, such as the SWP and the best miners, because this would be an effective veto of the miners whose jobs weren't immediately affected, stopping those miners whose jobs were affected for fighting for their own jobs. And contrary to all the rubbish that was talked at the time, there was actually an NUM delegate conference with delegates from every area, which actually rejected the call for a ballot. So this whole thing was democratically rejected by the majority of the miners. And the defeat in Nottinghamshire meant that the fight now shifted to stopping the use of coal and the movement of coal. And that depended on solidarity from other workers, in particular rail workers, lorry drivers, power workers and steel workers. And the rail workers did deliver. Hardly a lump of coal was delivered by rail workers throughout the whole year of the strike, including that was a lot of that was a real sacrifice for those workers and a fantastic display of solidarity. But sadly that wasn't the case with other workers, and the Tories were very careful not to open any other second front, so they made sure that the other key workers all got big pay rises. They were kind of bought off. Any possible disputes were concessions were made to stop them coming out alongside the miners. The leaders of the Transport and General Workers Union, now Unite, the biggest union at the time, as it is today, which organised a lot of these workers, did absolutely nothing to stop lorry drivers, for example, moving coal around the country. And there was, and one of the crucial battles was stopping supplies of coke and coal to the steel plants around the country. And I mentioned the steel workers had been defeated several years earlier. The leaders of their union, the ISTC, were very right-wing, and the NUM leaders, on top of this, in the areas, made deals with the ISTC leaders in the various parts of the country that they would maintain coal supplies, coke supplies to the steel plants to keep production going. And the crucial battle developed over this, really, because obviously rank and file miners could see this was a disaster. And especially in Yorkshire, they targeted the Orgreave coke depot in Sheffield, which was where all the coke was gathered and shipped to the Scunthorpe steelworks. And Yorkshire miners picketed the plant from late May, but the area officials, even in Yorkshire, refused to send enough pickets on a consistent basis to really shut the plant. On 18th of June, thousands of pickets, mostly from Yorkshire and elsewhere, descended on the plant to finally shut it. But this was really, they walked into a trap. So miners basically wearing T-shirts and trainers on a hot summer's day were attacked by heavily armed riot police, including police on horses. And BBC News that night notoriously showed scenes of the picket line, but they reversed the footage, so viewers saw miners defending themselves, throwing bricks they picked up off the ground at the police. They showed that first, but in fact the reality was the other way around. Every part of the state, including the BBC, was mobilised against the miners. 95 miners were arrested that day, and every single one of them was acquitted after the strike. There were completely no charges to answer at all. They were the victims, not the perpetrators. And really what was needed here was a repeat of what had happened during the 1972 strike, where a similar situation had developed around Saltley Coke Depot in Birmingham. I think it was a gas. It was owned by British Gas, and what happened there is the Arthur Scargill had basically gone to the meeting of engineering shop stewards and basically demanded they went out on strike and brought their members down to the picket line. And this was the night before, and every single factory in Birmingham shut down, and 10,000 workers marched to Saltley Gates and shut the place down. And that was really the turning point of that particular strike. And this did not happen this time because of the sabotage of the union officials, sadly including the NUM area officials. And where was I? Yeah, so this was obviously a major setback for the strike, and but it was by no means over, because in July there was another great chance for the miners to really turn the tide and win. And for dockers at the time, they were covered by something called the National Dock Labour Scheme, and that basically guaranteed dockers' jobs and wages. But the problem was there were a number of docks that opened up which were not covered by the scheme, and basically the coal board was bringing in coal from abroad through the non-dock labour scheme ports, and this was a threat to dockers' jobs as well as miners' jobs. So I think dockers at Immingham, which was the nearest port to Scunthorpe, basically were refusing to unload scab iron ore coming in from whatever it was. They were refusing to allow, it was ore it was. They were refusing to unload it onto scab trucks, and they walked out. And the response, the T&G did call a national dock strike, but they refused to turn it into a fight to extend the National Dock Labour Scheme to the non-scheme ports. And eventually the strike, to the Thatcher's great relief, ended after 10 days. And now the miners really were on the back foot, and the Tories' latest scheme to beat them down was to start to organise a back-to-work movement, as it was called. So they were trying to now get miners to return to work in their pits, obviously. So from trying to spread the action, the dispute was now very much on the defensive, with the miners increasingly forced to put up picket lines on their own pits. And particularly in Yorkshire, pit villages were occupied by hundreds of police, and there were wholesale arrests and beatings and general harassment of the miners and their families. Something like 11,291 miners were arrested throughout the dispute, and many of them threatened with very long terms of imprisonment for doing absolutely nothing. But things were not going 100% for the Tories, because despite their public show of intransigence, the strike was breaking the strike was extremely costly for the economy, because the power stations were running on expensive imported oil, the nuclear power stations were running at full capacity, and coal stocks were running down. So if the labour movement had refused to move coal, as they had in the previous strikes, it was still possible for the miners to win. In September, the TUC held its annual conference in Brighton, which was lobbied by thousands of miners and their supporters, demanding that the unions black all movement of all coal. And Scargill got 2 standing ovations from the conference, and the conference agreed to increase financial support for the NUM and not to move coke or coal across NUM picket lines. But all this was really just for public consumption, to fob off the NUM. In fact, it remained a dead letter throughout the strike. And all the TUC did was concentrate on fruitless efforts to beg and plead with the Tory government to negotiate, which of course they weren't going to do. And while the miners were, the miners were left isolated by the trade union leaders, that was not at all the case amongst rank and file workers and the left, because miners' support groups sprung up across the country. Where basically individual union branches would twin with local pits, and miner support groups would also twin with individual pits as well, and they would organise to deliver practical solidarity to the striking miners in terms of food and money week in, week out. This was crucial to keep the dispute going. In fact, millions of pounds was collected from the miners across the country in the whole year of the strike. In fact, something like 66,000 was collected, I'm assured, by Roger Huddle in Waltham Forest alone. Just a bit of just to say that. Anyway, not that I lived in Waltham Forest in those days, nothing to do with me. Anyway, and I think the other crucial thing to talk about is the transformation in miners' and other workers' ideas during the strike, despite it ending in defeat. And obviously, I'm sure you've all seen the film Pride, which shows the impact that this sort of solidarity the miners received from LGBT plus people, the impact it had on changing their ideas, the Welsh area NUM banner leading the gay pride demonstration after the end of the strike that year. But also the miners' ideas on sexism and racism were also challenged. I lived in Brixton at the time, and when they went out, the miners I knew went out picketing in Brixton. They were from little pit villages. When they never saw a black person, they were a bit nervous, but their buckets were full because this was just after the Brixton riots, and black people had got kicking from the police, and now they saw the miners having the same thing, and they knew which side they were on, and that was really had a big effect on the miners that experienced it. And also sexism. I mean, the Yorkshire Miner, which was the paper of the Yorkshire area, actually had a page 3 pin-up at the start of the strike, quite disgracefully, but that rapidly disappeared from the paper after arguments from socialist women and others that this was not, bloody hell, this wasn't acceptable. And there was sexist chanting on picket lines at the beginning, and that all kind of ended following, after arguments and stuff. And most of the wives, as they were called in those days, of the miners had been very much confined to traditional roles before the strike, and they really came into their own as the strike went on. They became the backbone of the resistance. They organised picketing, they went to speak at union meetings to argue for support, they collected money on the streets, as well as doing things like running the food kitchens to feed the miners and their families. So in November came yet another chance for the miners to win. And this time it was the pit deputies who were, the hope really. And basically these were people they were the foremen they were all basically all men in the pits, and they weren't actually part of the dispute, and they'd been paid by the coal board to stay at home throughout the dispute. But now the NCB told them they had to report to work, which meant crossing picket lines in most of the country. Their union, which was called NACODS, balloted its members for action, including the pits that were working. So if that strike had gone ahead, that would been, and knots could not have carried on because they were crucial to keeping the pits working. And they overwhelmingly voted for strike action. And Thatcher actually recalled in her memoirs, quote, "We were in danger of losing everything. It could have brought down the government." But sadly, just before the strike was due to start, the NACODS leaders called it off in return for a pathetic offer by the NCP of a review of pit closures, which turned out to be just meaningless, to kind of fob them off and give them an excuse not to call off the strike. So 5 minutes left. Probably a bit less than that. But so now the Tories really started to tighten the screw, and they really wheeled out all the courts on their side. And the High Court actually ruled the strike was illegal, but the NUM ignored it. And the court then ordered the seizure of all the union's assets, including its headquarters. But the TUC did nothing, despite this being a kind of flagrant attack on workers' rights through fear of the law. And the NCB also offered huge bribes to miners to go back to work, and people were desperate by this point. They hadn't had any income for 9 months. And the police drove single scabs in a great big coach with a massive police escort through the picket lines. They couldn't do any work, but it was just about demoralising the miners. The food kitchens were cut off from funding by the NUM, and this was there's a real risk by Christmas of miners being literally starved back to work. And this was where the support groups really came into their own again, because they made a massive effort to make sure that the miners and their families had a decent Christmas. And I remember going on a coach with my miners support group up to Goldthorpe, and it was a very moving experience that I'll never forget. and supplies really flooded in to the miners, not just in Britain, but from the Ruhr, the mining area of Germany. There was lots of stuff coming in all Australian miners, people all over the world were right behind the miners and did their best to make sure they weren't stirred back to work. In January, the TUC again tried to broker talks, but of course they were vetoed by Thatcher, who now smelled blood really, because miners were beginning to trickle back to work. They were in a desperate state really, and many of them had no gas or electricity for throughout the winter. They'd been cut off. They were getting threatening letters. They'd be eviction. The kids didn't have enough to eat, and there seemed to be no hope. And by this point, by February, officials in South Wales, right-wing officials of the NUM, began to push for return to work without any back-to-work agreement with the NCB, and this in turn, undermined the strike as miners really began to think this is the end and began to return to work. Finally, on the 3rd of March, an NUM National Delegate Conference voted very narrowly to return to work, and 2 days later the miners marched back to work with their banners flying, their heads held high, led by their brass bands. They'd been defeated, but they had not been broken. So there's a lot more to say, but I'll stop there.
Okay.